In the great city of Valinor, the sun cast long shadows over the towering silver spires of the Elven kingdom. The elves lived in a world of perfection, their beauty unchanging, their magic unrivaled. For centuries, they had ruled over the humans with an iron fist, keeping them as laborers, as servants, as nothing more than tools to maintain their eternal kingdom. The humans, with their short lives and limited abilities, were treated as less than the elves, weak and unimportant. Thorn, a simple blacksmith, worked in the heart of the city, far from the grand halls where the elven rulers sat. His days were filled with the ringing sound of hammer against anvil, shaping metal into tools for the elves. Yet Thorn had always felt there was something wrong with the way things were. He had watched his people suffer under the elves' cruel rule, seen the way they were treated as though their lives meant nothing. But Thorn had never dared to speak out. To do so would mean death. That all changed the day he found the sword. It wasn't much to look at, buried deep beneath the floor of his smithy, hidden away in a forgotten corner. At first, it seemed like just another broken piece of metal, discarded and left to rust. But as soon as his fingers brushed the hilt, something strange happened. A faint hum filled the air, the metal glowing with a dim, golden light. Thorn's heart raced, his mind unable to make sense of what he was feeling. He pulled the sword from the ground, holding it carefully in his hands. It wasn't like any weapon he had ever seen. It was heavier, more powerful, and there was something about it, something ancient and alive, that made him feel like he was holding not just a blade, but a key to something greater. Thorn knew he had to keep it a secret. The elves would never allow such a thing to remain in the hands of a human. But that night, as he lay awake in his small home, the weight of the sword beside him, he could not shake the feeling that it had chosen him for a reason. The sword had power, power that no elven blade could match. The next morning, as Thorn worked at his forge, he overheard a conversation between two elven soldiers. They spoke of a raid planned against a nearby human village, a village that had long resisted elven rule. The soldiers laughed, as if the destruction of the village was nothing more than a minor task, another show of the elves' dominance over the humans. Something inside Thorn snapped. He had always kept his head down, always obeyed the elves. But today, as the sounds of their laughter filled his ears, he could feel the anger rising within him. The humans had suffered long enough. He had suffered long enough. With a sudden determination, Thorn grabbed the sword and strapped it to his back. He didn't know what would happen next, didn't know if he would survive the day, but he couldn't let the elves continue to crush his people without a fight. Thorn made his way through the city streets, keeping to the shadows as best he could. The elves walked proudly, their heads held high, unaware of the storm that was about to hit them. As Thorn neared the gates of the city, he saw a group of elven soldiers preparing for the raid. They laughed again, and Thorn could see the villagers, weak, frightened, gathering in the distance, ready to be herded like animals. With his heart pounding, Thorn stepped forward, his hand tightening around the sword's hilt. Enough, he muttered to himself. The soldiers turned at the sound of his voice, their eyes narrowing in confusion. What is this? One of them sneered, drawing his own sword. Thorn didn't wait. With a speed he had never known he had, he drew the blade, swinging it with all his strength. The sword seemed to move on its own, cutting through the air with a sound like thunder. The elven soldiers were quick, but they were not ready for the force behind Thorn's strike. In seconds, the first soldier fell, his weapon shattered by Thorn's blade. The others hesitated, their faces filled with disbelief. A human, one of them, had dared to fight back. Thorn's heart raced, but his mind was clear. He knew this was only the beginning. The sword, the power within it, had awakened something inside him. It was no longer just a blacksmith who stood before them. It was someone ready to challenge the very world they had built. The battle had begun. The victory at the gates of Valinor sent a shockwave through the Elven kingdom. Thorn had never imagined that he, a simple blacksmith, would strike such a blow to the heart of their power. The Elven soldiers, used to facing no resistance from humans, had been caught off guard. But Thorn wasn't just lucky. The sword he had found was more than just a weapon. It was something ancient, something powerful, and it had given him the strength to do what he had once thought impossible. After the fight, Thorn fled into the wilderness with the sword strapped to his back. He knew the elves would be searching for him. They would not let a single human defy them without swift punishment. Thorn needed to get far away to find allies and to build a resistance. The small group of villagers who had witnessed his victory were already whispering of a rebellion, but Thorn knew the path ahead would be difficult. A few brave souls would not be enough. For days, Thorn wandered through the forest, avoiding elven patrols. He kept moving, sleeping under the stars, his mind filled with thoughts of the future. The sword hummed softly in his hand, as if urging him forward. It was clear to him now that his discovery had not been a random event. He had been chosen for something greater. But what? And why him? One evening, while resting beside a stream, Thorn heard voices. He tensed, instinctively reaching for the sword. But as the figure stepped into view, his tension eased. They were humans, not elves. A tall man with a weathered face and a scar across his cheek stepped forward, raising a hand in greeting. "I thought we'd find you here," he said with a rough voice. "Word of your victory spread fast. You're a legend now." Thorn glanced at the man, unsure of his intentions. But the sword seemed to pulse gently in his hand, as if telling him to trust this stranger. "Who are you?" Thorn asked, his voice cautious. The man smiled, showing a missing tooth. "Name's Kellen. I was part of a group that's been fighting the elves for years. We've been waiting for someone like you, someone with the courage to lead. We've heard of your actions in Valimor." Thorn nodded slowly, feeling the weight of what Kellen had said. He had fought out of anger, out of a need to protect his people, but to lead? He wasn't sure he was ready for that responsibility. "Join us," Kellen continued. "We have a camp nearby, a group of rebels, humans who are tired of being oppressed. We need someone who can unite us, someone who can show us that we don't have to bow to the elves anymore." Thorn hesitated. He had spent his life serving the elves, obeying their every command, never questioning their rule. To stand against them was terrifying. But the sword in his hand whispered to him, filling him with a strange sense of purpose. "All right," Thorn said finally, his voice steady. "I'll come with you. But we need a plan. We can't take on the elves without more than just a few rebels." Kellen's eyes sparkled with approval. "We've been gathering support. There are villages and towns scattered across the kingdom where the elves' hold is weak. We can strike where they least expect it, but we need someone to lead the charge. Someone who believes that we can actually win." Over the next few days, Thorn joined Kellen and his group. They moved quickly, traveling under the cover of night to avoid detection. Along the way, Thorn met others who had joined the rebellion, farmers, hunters, traders, all with their own reasons for hating the elves. Some had lost family members to elven cruelty. Others had seen their homes destroyed by elven soldiers. All of them were ready to fight, to finally stand up for themselves. As they journeyed together, Thorn could feel the weight of the responsibility growing. He had always been a blacksmith, a craftsman, not a leader. But the more he spoke to these people, the more he realized they had no one else. They looked to him for guidance, for hope, for strength. He had to be more than just a man with a sword. He had to be their symbol of defiance, their chance at freedom. The rebellion was starting to take shape. Thorn's courage had inspired others, and the fires of rebellion were beginning to spread across the land. But the elves would not give up their kingdom easily. Queen Elira, the ruler of Valimor, was not one to tolerate such defiance. Thorn and his new allies would soon find that the elves' magic was far stronger than anything they had ever faced before. But Thorn had something the elves did not: the fire of human determination, the willingness to fight for a future free from tyranny. And with that fire, he would lead them to battle. The storm was gathering, and it would not be long before it would break. The wind carried the smell of smoke and earth as Thorn and his new allies approached the small elven outpost. The sun was low, casting long shadows across the quiet forest, and the air was thick with tension. The rebellion was still young, and this was their first real test. If they could succeed here, it would show the elves that their rule was not as unshakable as they believed. The group had spent the last few days preparing for this moment. They had learned the patrol routes, studied the layout of the outpost, and gathered whatever weapons they could find. Thorn's band of rebels was small, but they were determined, and that made them dangerous. The sword he carried pulsed with a faint energy, reminding him that they had something the elves didn't: the will to fight back. As they hid in the trees on the outskirts of the outpost, Kellen turned to Thorn. His weathered face was serious, and his voice was low. "This is it," he said. "Once we strike, there's no turning back. We need to move fast." Thorn nodded, feeling the weight of the moment settle on his shoulders. He had led them here, but this would be the first time he would face the elves in battle. The thought made his heart race, but he pushed it aside. Fear would not help them now. The plan was simple. They would attack under the cover of darkness, using the trees and the shadows to hide their movements. The elves, so used to being the ones who controlled the battlefield, would never see them coming. It was a strategy born of necessity. Humans had no magic, no centuries of power to rely on. But they had their brains, their determination, and the strength to fight back. With a signal from Thorn, the rebels moved silently toward the outpost. They crept through the underbrush, careful not to make a sound. The elves, with their sharp senses and long lives, were not easy prey. But the humans knew the land better than anyone, and they used it to their advantage. As they neared the outer walls of the outpost, Thorn's heart beat loudly in his ears. He could hear the elven guards talking in the distance, their voices carrying on the wind. They were relaxed, unaware of the danger that was closing in on them. The first blow came swiftly. One of the rebels, a young woman named Dara, who had once been a hunter, crept up behind a guard and struck him down with a swift blow. The guard fell silently, and before anyone could notice, she had disappeared back into the shadows. The rest of the rebels moved quickly, following the plan they had rehearsed. They attacked the patrols in small groups, each strike precise and efficient. Thorn was at the front, his sword drawn and ready. The blade felt heavier in his hand now, as though it was alive, eager for battle. The elves were fast and their magic was powerful, but it was no match for the humans' quick thinking. Thorn saw an elven soldier raise his hand, calling forth a bolt of lightning from the sky. But before the soldier could release it, Kellen lunged forward, knocking him to the ground with a force that surprised even Thorn. The rebels' strength and speed were impressive, and the elves were not prepared for this new kind of enemy. As the battle raged on, Thorn's mind raced. He could feel the energy of the sword flowing through him, giving him strength he never thought possible. The elves were losing their confidence, their arrogance slipping away as they realized they were not as invincible as they had once believed. Thorn fought with everything he had, his movements quick and decisive. He parried a strike from an elven sword master and countered with a slash that sent the soldier staggering back. The sword in his hand hummed with power, guiding him, giving him the edge he needed to overcome the elven warriors. By the time the first light of dawn began to break over the horizon, the outpost was in chaos. The elves had been pushed back, their patrols scattered. The humans had won their first battle, but they knew this was just the beginning. There were more elves out there, and they would not let this rebellion go unanswered. Thorn stood in the middle of the battlefield, breathing heavily, his sword dripping with the remnants of the fight. Around him, the rebels were gathering their wounded, making sure no one was left behind. It had been a hard victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. Kellen clapped Thorn on the back, his rough voice full of pride. "We did it," he said. "We showed them what happens when humans decide to fight back." Thorn nodded, but his mind was already focused on the next step. The elves would come for them. He knew that, but the spark had been lit, and there was no turning back now. The victory at the elven outpost had sent ripples throughout the land. It was a small win, but it meant something much bigger. The humans had proven they could fight back, that they weren't as helpless as the elves had always believed. Thorn could feel the shift in the air, the rising hope in the hearts of those who had long been oppressed. But he also knew that this victory would not go unanswered. After the battle, Thorn and the rebels retreated into the mountains, a place far from the prying eyes of the Elven kingdom. They needed time to rest, to heal their wounds, and to regroup. The sword he carried seemed to hum with energy, urging him to keep moving, to keep pushing forward. It had become a part of him now, its power coursing through his veins. But with each passing day, Thorn began to feel the weight of the responsibility growing heavier. He was no longer just a blacksmith. He was a leader, whether he wanted to be or not. In the mountains, the rebels built a hidden camp, a place where they could train, gather supplies, and prepare for the next phase of the rebellion. Thorn had never been a leader before. He was used to working with his hands, shaping metal, not leading a group of fighters. But the more he saw the determination in their eyes, the more he realized they were looking to him for guidance. Kellen, who had been a fighter long before Thorn, took charge of the training. He worked with the rebels, teaching them how to fight with swords, how to move silently, how to survive in the wild. Thorn, though still new to this role, helped where he could. He gave them advice on forging weapons, using the skills he had learned as a blacksmith. But most importantly, he listened. He listened to their stories, their fears, their hopes. As the days turned into weeks, word of the rebellion spread. Villages that had long been under Elven control began to rise up, inspired by the humans' courage. The elves were losing their grip on the kingdom, and they could feel it. Queen Elira, the ruler of Valemor, was furious. She had underestimated the humans for far too long, and now they were proving to be a much greater threat than she had ever imagined. In her castle, high atop the silver spires of Valemor, Elira convened with her most trusted generals. Her pale eyes glowed with anger as she spoke. "These humans will pay for their insolence," she said, her voice cold and sharp. "They dare to challenge us, to defy us? We will crush them before they have the chance to rise any further." Her generals nodded in agreement, their faces grim. They knew the Elven army was powerful, their magic unmatched, but there was something about this human rebellion that felt different. It wasn't just the sword Thorn had found. There was a fire in the humans, a fire that couldn't be easily extinguished. Back in the mountains, Thorn sat alone by a campfire, his mind heavy with the knowledge of what was to come. He could feel the storm building, the weight of the battle that loomed ahead. He knew the elves would come for them. They wouldn't stop until every last human who dared to stand against them was destroyed. But Thorn wasn't afraid. In the quiet of the night, with the sword at his side, he made a vow to himself. He would not let his people fall. He would fight with everything he had for the freedom of those who had lived in fear for far too long. The next morning, as the first light of dawn broke over the mountain peaks, Kellen approached him. "Thorn," he said, his voice serious, "we've heard reports. The elves are gathering an army. They're coming." Thorn stood up, his hand resting on the hilt of the sword. "We're ready," he said, his voice steady. "We will meet them head on. We'll fight for every village, for every person who's ever been oppressed by their rule." Kellen nodded, his expression one of respect. "You've changed, Thorn. You become more than a blacksmith. You become the leader we needed." Thorn didn't say anything. He didn't need to. He knew that the battle ahead would not be easy. The elves were powerful, their magic unmatched, but they had something the elves didn't, the heart to fight for what was right. The storm was coming, and Thorn was ready to face it. The days had grown colder as autumn slipped into winter. The once quiet mountains now buzzed with activity, as Thorn and the rebels prepared for the battle they all knew was coming. The elves, angered and determined, were assembling their forces, and it wouldn't be long before they arrived at the hidden rebel camp. The sense of urgency was thick in the air, a constant reminder that time was running out. Thorn had spent the last few days in deep thought. As the leader of the rebellion, every decision he made now carried the weight of countless lives. The sword he carried was not just a weapon anymore. It had become a symbol of hope, a beacon to those who had long lived in fear of the elves' power. And it was that power Thorn needed to outsmart, to fight against. The rebels had grown in number, drawn by stories of victory, of a man who dared to challenge the elves. They had come from villages all over the kingdom, farmers, hunters, merchants, and even former soldiers who had grown tired of serving the elves. All of them had one thing in common, the desire for freedom. Kellen had done a good job training the rebels. They were ready, but Thorn knew that even with the most skilled fighters, they would be outmatched by the Elven army's magic and experience. The elves fought with precision, and their spells were powerful enough to tear down entire villages. But Thorn had learned something in his time leading this group. The elves had grown too comfortable, too used to being unchallenged. "We don't need to defeat them in a direct fight," Thorn said one evening, addressing the gathered rebels around a crackling fire. "We need to make them afraid. We need to show them that the humans are no longer afraid to fight back, and that we are willing to sacrifice everything to win." Kellen nodded. "You're right. We can't match them spell for spell, but we can strike their weak points. We know this land better than they do. We've been living in their shadow for too long. It's time to take the fight to them." The plan was simple but dangerous. Thorn had chosen a series of key targets, supply lines, communication hubs, and outposts that the elves relied on to maintain their control. Each attack would be swift and precise, hitting the elves where they least expected it. It wouldn't be enough to defeat them outright, but it would send a message. The elves were not invincible. The rebels moved under the cover of night, traveling in small groups to avoid detection. Thorn led the first group, his heart pounding as they approached the first target. It was a small supply camp, tucked away at the base of a cliff. The elves stationed there were few, but their defenses were still strong. Thorn and his group hid in the trees, watching the camp from a distance. The sentries patrolled lazily, their minds clearly not focused on the humans they considered beneath them. "We strike fast. We strike hard," Thorn whispered to the rebels, his voice low but steady. "Take out the sentries first, then we hit the supplies. Don't let them regroup." With swift movements, they rushed toward the camp. The sentries never had a chance. The rebels overwhelmed them, silent as shadows, knocking them out before they could even raise the alarm. The rest of the rebels quickly set to work, setting fire to the elven supplies, destroying weapons and food that the army would need. The camp was in flames within minutes. "Let's go," Thorn ordered. The rebels didn't hesitate. They retreated into the forest, leaving behind only smoke and ashes. By the time the elven forces arrived at the destroyed camp, it was too late. The rebels had vanished into the trees, their movements faster than the elves could follow. Thorn's heart raced, but a sense of satisfaction filled him. This was just the beginning. If they could strike from the shadows, they could keep the elves on edge, never giving them a moment's peace. Over the next several weeks, the rebels continued their raids, each success built on the last, each attack adding to their growing confidence. Word spread quickly among the humans. The rebellion was real. The elves' control over the land was slipping, bit by bit. But the elves were not idle. They responded with fury, sending soldiers to track down the rebels, to crush the growing resistance before it could become a real threat. Thorn knew they couldn't keep up this kind of hit-and-run tactic forever. The elves would eventually find them, and when they did, they would come in full force. The final battle was coming, and Thorn could feel it in his bones. But for now, the rebellion had the upper hand. They had shown the elves that they could be defeated. They had shown them that the humans were no longer afraid. As Thorn stood alone one night, looking out over the mountains, the wind blowing through the trees, he knew that the storm was coming. The elves would not let this stand, but neither would he. The days had grown colder, and the rebel camp was quiet, save for the soft crackling of the fire. Thorn stood near the edge of the camp, his eyes scanning the darkened forest, alert for any sign of movement. His mind raced with thoughts of the upcoming battle. The elves would come. He could feel it in his bones. Their retaliation would be swift, and they would not stop until every last human in the rebellion was crushed. But Thorn refused to back down. He had seen the strength and courage of his people. They had proven that they were not to be underestimated. The elves may have magic and centuries of power, but the humans had something they could never take away: determination. "We've made them angry," Kellen said, stepping up beside Thorn. "We've burned their supplies, struck their outposts. They won't take this lightly." Thorn nodded. He had always known that striking the elves would have consequences, but he also knew it was their only chance. The rebellion couldn't survive in the shadows forever. They needed to make their stand, to show the elves they would no longer cower. "We need to be ready," Thorn said, his voice low. "We'll hit them hard before they have the chance to fully regroup. The longer we keep them on the defensive, the better." Kellen gave him a sharp nod. "We got scouts keeping an eye on their movements. The elves are gathering in force. We'll need to move quickly before they have a chance to strike us first." Thorn turned away from the fire, his thoughts turning to the battle ahead. They had already struck several key targets in the Elven kingdom, but Thorn knew the real fight was still to come. The elves were not fools. They would come for the rebels with everything they had: magic, strategy, and the sheer power of their army. But Thorn had one thing the elves did not: an army of people willing to fight for their freedom. The next few days were spent preparing. The rebels fortified their camp, setting traps and creating hidden paths to escape if needed. They trained relentlessly, honing their skills and practicing their strategies. The sword in Thorn's hand seemed to grow heavier with each passing day. It was no longer just a weapon. It had become a symbol of their struggle, a symbol of everything they were fighting for. Then, one evening, the scouts brought word that the elves were on the move. The time had come. Thorn gathered the leaders of the rebellion around a large map, their faces grim but determined. They were ready. The elves are marching toward us, Kellen said, his finger pointing to a distant area on the map. They'll be here in 2 days. We don't have much time. Thorn studied the map carefully. The elves were powerful, but they weren't invincible. There were weaknesses in their ranks, small gaps in their defenses that the rebels could exploit. It would be dangerous, but they didn't have a choice. We need to hit them hard and fast, Thorn said, his voice steady. We'll use the land to our advantage. We know these forests better than they do. We'll strike from the trees, take out their supply lines, and hit their commanders. The longer we can keep them off balance, the better. The leaders of the rebellion nodded in agreement. They had come this far together, and they would not stop now. As night fell over the camp, the rebels gathered their weapons and prepared for the battle ahead. The air was thick with anticipation. They would face the elves head-on, and they knew that not all of them would make it out alive. But they also knew that this was their fight, their chance to break free from the chains that had bound them for so long. Thorn stood at the edge of the camp once more, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. The cold wind bit at his skin, but he barely noticed. His mind was focused on the battle ahead, on the lives that depended on him, on the future of the rebellion. Are we ready? Kellen asked, appearing beside him once more. Thorn turned to face him, his eyes hard with resolve. We're as ready as we'll ever be. The elves were coming, and Thorn was determined to make them regret ever underestimating the humans. The final battle was about to begin. The dawn arrived with a chill, the sky painted in shades of gray. The mountain winds howled through the trees, carrying with them the scent of wet earth. It was the calm before the storm, and Thorn could feel it in his bones. The elves were coming. They had already shown their fury and their rage, but today would be different. Today, the rebellion would face them head-on. Thorn stood at the edge of the camp, looking out over the valley below. The rebels had set up defensive positions, hidden among the trees and rocks, waiting for the elven army to make its move. The forest was quiet, almost unnervingly so. Thorn's fingers tightened around the hilt of his sword as he thought about what was at stake. This was the moment they had all been waiting for. This battle would determine the future of the rebellion. If they lost, the elves would crush them without mercy. If they won, it would be the beginning of the end for elven rule. Kellen appeared beside him, his face grim but resolute. They're coming. The scouts saw them on the move. It won't be long before they're here. Thorn nodded, though his mind was racing. The elves were known for their speed and their magic. It would be a difficult battle, and he knew that their best chance was to strike first, to hit the elves when they least expected it. We'll move out at first light, Thorn said. We'll use the forest to our advantage. Stay in the shadows, stay silent. We hit them hard, and we hit them fast. The longer we can keep them on edge, the better. Kellen gave a sharp nod. We've trained for this. We can do it. The rebels gathered around the fire one last time before the battle began. There was a quiet determination in their eyes. They had all seen what the elves were capable of, and yet they were here, ready to fight, ready to risk everything for their freedom. Thorn felt a surge of pride in his chest. These people were no longer just survivors. They were warriors. The sun began to rise, casting a dim light over the land. The first of the elven soldiers appeared on the horizon, their silver armor gleaming in the light. They moved with practiced precision, as if they had already won, but they were wrong. The humans had something the elves didn't, the will to fight, the fire to push through, no matter the odds. Stay low, Thorn ordered. Move out. The rebels slipped through the trees, their movements swift and silent. They had spent weeks preparing for this moment, and now everything was about to come to a head. Thorn led the way, his heart pounding in his chest. He could see the elven army beginning to spread out across the valley, their numbers growing larger with each passing moment, but they were too focused on their own plans to notice the rebels creeping closer. When they were within striking distance, Thorn raised his hand, signaling for the rebels to stop. The elves were still unaware of their presence. Thorn's mind was clear, his focus razor sharp. This was their moment. Now, Thorn shouted. The rebels surged forward, emerging from the trees like ghosts. They attacked swiftly, catching the elves off guard. Thorn's sword was a blur as he cut down an elven soldier, his movements guided by instinct and the power of the ancient blade. Kellen was at his side, cutting through the elven ranks with ruthless efficiency. The elves scrambled to regroup, but the rebels were relentless. They used the trees for cover, striking quickly and disappearing back into the shadows before the elves could retaliate. The elven soldiers were trained, but they weren't prepared for this kind of fight. The humans were unpredictable, and that made them dangerous. Thorn could hear the shouts of the elven commanders, their voices growing more frantic as they tried to rally their forces. The rebellion was pushing them back, and the elves' confidence was beginning to slip. Thorn could see the doubt in their eyes as they realized they weren't facing just a small group of rebels. They were facing an army of people willing to die for their freedom. But the elves were not easily defeated. With a command from their generals, the elven magic began to flare up, the air crackling with power. Bolts of lightning shot toward the rebels, and the ground shook beneath their feet. Thorn gritted his teeth, knowing they had to move quickly. The elves' magic was formidable, but it had its limits. They could use the trees, the rocks, the land itself to protect them. "We need to strike the commanders," Kellen shouted over the chaos. "Take out their leaders, and the rest will scatter." Thorn nodded, his mind already working through the plan. They had taken the elves by surprise, but they couldn't rely on that advantage for long. The time had come to finish what they had started. With Kellen at his side, Thorn pushed forward, making his way toward the elven commanders. The battle raged around them, but they were focused on one thing: victory. The battle had raged on for hours, the forest alive with the sounds of clashing steel, shouts, and the crackling of magic. Thorn's heart pounded as he fought, each swing of his sword a testament to the fight for freedom that had brought them this far. The elves, though powerful and skilled, were starting to show signs of wear. Their confidence had faltered, and now, in the heart of the forest, the rebels were proving that they could stand up to the might of the elven army. Thorn pushed forward through the chaos, his eyes fixed on the elven commanders. If they could take out the leaders, the rest of the elven forces might break. He could see the commanders now, standing in the center of the battlefield, surrounded by their guards. They were powerful, their magic crackling in the air, but Thorn knew they weren't invincible. Kellen was by his side, cutting through elven soldiers with the same precision and skill he had shown in their earlier raids. Together, they moved as one, a well-oiled machine, each step calculated and every strike landing true. They fought with everything they had, with the knowledge that their lives, and the lives of their people, depended on this battle. "We're close," Kellen said, breathless but determined. "Keep pushing." Thorn nodded, his grip tight on his sword. The elves were starting to retreat, but they weren't giving up without a fight. Their magic was powerful, lightning and fire crackling through the air, but the rebels had the advantage of numbers and surprise. They had trained for this moment, and they weren't about to let it slip away. As they neared the commanders, Thorn's heart quickened. This was the moment that could turn the tide of the battle. If they could take down the leaders, the elves would lose their command, their direction. It was the one chance they had to win. Thorn and Kellen pushed through a group of elven soldiers, their swords flashing in the dim light of the forest. The elven guards fell back as they reached the commanders, but the leaders were ready. The air grew thick with magic as the elven commanders raised their hands, preparing to strike. Thorn didn't hesitate. He lunged forward, his sword cutting through the air. One of the commanders, an elven sorcerer with glowing eyes, raised his hand to unleash a bolt of magic. But Thorn was faster. With a powerful swing, he struck the sorcerer's arm, knocking the magic off course. The bolt of lightning struck a nearby tree, splitting it in two. The sorcerer staggered back, shocked by the force of Thorn's strike. Thorn didn't give him a chance to recover. He pressed forward, his sword finding its mark, and the sorcerer fell to the ground with a final stunned gasp. Kellen was already on the other commander, a tall elven warrior with a silver blade. The two clashed in a flurry of steel, each trying to gain the upper hand. Kellen moved with lightning speed, his strikes precise and deadly. The elven warrior fought back with equal skill, but Kellen's experience as a fighter was undeniable. With a well-timed blow, Kellen disarmed the elven commander, sending his sword flying through the air. The commander stumbled, and Kellen took the opportunity to strike, his sword cutting through the air with deadly force. The two commanders were down, and with them, the Elven army lost its leadership. The remaining Elven soldiers hesitated, unsure of what to do without their commanders to guide them. The rebels didn't wait for them to recover. They pressed the advantage, striking with everything they had. The Elven forces began to break, their lines crumbling as the rebels surged forward. The tide of battle had shifted, and now it was the elves who were on the defensive. Thorin could see the panic in their eyes as they realized they were losing. For the first time in centuries, the elves were being beaten back by humans. Thorin's breath came in ragged gasps as he looked around the battlefield. The fight was far from over, but the rebels had won a crucial victory. They had taken down the Elven commanders, and now the rest of the Elven army was retreating, their morale shattered. The rebels let out a cheer as they pressed forward, driving the elves from the battlefield. The forest echoed with their victory, the sound of their triumph filling the air. As the last of the Elven soldiers fled, Thorin stood in the center of the battlefield, his sword raised high. The rebels had done it. They had proven that even the most powerful empire could be defeated. They had shown the elves that humanity would not be subjugated any longer. Thorin's heart swelled with pride. The battle was over, but the war was far from won. The road ahead would be long and hard, but today, they had taken the first step toward freedom. And that was all that mattered. The rebels had won, and the elves would never forget it.